Welcome, dear listeners, to Miss Marple and the Hidden Pact at Ivy Cottage, a cozy mystery in the timeless style of Agatha Christie. Join the sharp-witted Miss Jane Marple as she unravels secrets in the quaint village of St. Mary Mead. Settle in with a cup of tea. This tale of hidden alliances, clever deceptions, and village intrigue is perfect for a relaxing afternoon. Our story unfolds over 10 chapters, each about 8 to 10 minutes when narrated. For easy navigation, chapter timestamps are included. Let us begin. Chapter 1. The Shadow over Ivy Cottage. In the early 1950s, the village of St. Mary Mead lay cradled in the gentle embrace of England's green hills, a place where time seemed to pause, as if reluctant to disturb the rhythm of its quiet days. The sun cast dappled light through ancient oaks, and the scent of blooming roses mingled with the earthy tang of freshly turned soil. Thatched cottages, their roofs weathered to a soft golden hue, lined the winding lanes, and the church spire stood sentinel over a community where everyone knew everyone else's business. Or so they thought. At the heart of this idyllic scene stood Ivy Cottage, a quaint, vine-draped dwelling that seemed to whisper tales of bygone years. Its occupant, Mrs. Eleanor Hargrove, a widow of 72 with a penchant for privacy, was as much a fixture of the village as the ancient yew tree by the vicarage. Miss Jane Marple, an elderly spinster with eyes as sharp as her knitting needles, sat in her cozy parlor at Mead Cottage, her fingers deftly working a skein of pink wool into a scarf destined for a distant niece. Her window framed a familiar tableau. Mr. Jenkins, the postman, pedaling his bicycle with a cheerful whistle. Mrs. Price, the baker's wife, sweeping her doorstep. And Reverend Thomas Hale, tending his roses with a meditative air. Miss Marple's mind, however, was not on the youth. A fleeting remark about old friends and a shared secret, dismissed with a laugh. Miss Marple, however, never dismissed such fragments. In her experience, village secrets had a way of blooming like weeds, persistent and troublesome. By midday, St. Mary Mead was abuzz. The young constable Slack, earnest but prone to hasty conclusions, had officially declared Mrs. Hargrove's death a natural one, citing her age and a history of mild palpitations. Yet whispers persisted, fueled by the arrival of Reginald Hargrove, Eleanor's nephew, who had descended from London in a sleek black car, his tailored suit and polished shoes stark against the village's rustic charm. Reginald, a banker in his 40s with a reputation for sharp dealings, had not visited St. Mary Mead in years, and his sudden presence stirred curiosity. He stood outside Ivy Cottage, his face a mask of grief, though Miss Marple, watching from a discreet distance, noted how his eyes flickered over the cottage's ivy-covered walls, as if calculating their worth. Inside the cottage, the air was heavy with the scent of lavender and wax polish, a testament to the diligence of Lily Parsons, the young maid who had served Eleanor faithfully. Lily, barely 20, with auburn curls and a freckled face, stood in the hall, twisting her apron in her hands as she spoke to a cluster of neighbors. "She was like a mother to me," Lily said, her voice breaking. "I found her this morning, just sitting there, her pen still in her hand. I thought she'd fallen asleep, but..." Tears spilled over, and Mrs. Price patted her shoulder, murmuring comforts. Miss Marple, under the pretense of paying her respects, made her way to Ivy Cottage that afternoon. The path was lined with wildflowers, their colors muted in the soft September light. But she noted something amiss. The ivy, usually trimmed with Eleanor's meticulous care, hung in ragged tendrils, as if neglected for weeks. Curious, Miss Marple murmured, her umbrella tapping the ground thoughtfully. Inside, the drawing room was a study in quiet elegance. Chintz curtains, a mahogany sideboard. Steady. Such a tragedy, and so sudden, for one so careful with her health. Reginald's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Yes, well, her heart was weak. Dr. Croft warned her, but she was stubborn. No enemies, of course, just a quiet life here. Miss Marple nodded, her fingers brushing the edge of the desk. Of course, though she did mention once a pact from her younger days. Something about old friends, a promise kept. Silly, perhaps, but it stayed with me. Reginald's teacup rattled in its saucer, a fleeting betrayal of composure. Aunt Eleanor loved her stories, he said quickly. Fanciful nonsense, nothing more. Lily, hovering nearby, glanced up, her eyes wide. She did talk of it, miss, she ventured, her voice barely above a whisper. A pact with school friends, something they swore to keep buried. She never said what, but it troubled her lately. Reginald shot Lily a look, sharp as a blade, but Miss Marple merely smiled, her mind cataloging every word, every gesture. The smudge on the teacup, the overgrown ivy, the unfinished letter. These were threads in a tapestry yet to be woven. And Eleanor Hargrove's death, she suspected, was no mere matter of a failing heart. As she left Ivy Cottage, the village seemed to close ranks around its secret. The vicar, Reverend Thomas Hale, passed by, his kindly face clouded as he tipped his hat. Amelia Hale, his wife, hurried along with a basket of apples, her smile too bright, her eyes avoiding Miss Marple's. Dr. Elias Croft, the village physician, strode toward the cottage, his black bag swinging, his expression one of practiced concern. And Harold Green, the gardener, paused in his work by the gate, his soil-stained hands gripping a spade with unnecessary force. Miss Marple walked home slowly, her mind as busy as her knitting needles. The hidden pact, the smudged teacup, the neglected ivy. These were not random. They were clues, hidden in the everyday, waiting for a keen eye to unravel them. And Miss Marple's eyes, as the village well knew, man in his 50s, with a shock of white hair and a voice that could fill the church without a microphone, stood by the gate, greeting villagers with a warm, if slightly strained, smile. His wife, Amelia Hale, fluttered about like a nervous sparrow, arranging trays of scones and teacups on a linen-covered table. Her auburn hair, pinned hastily, escaped in wisps, and her hands trembled as she poured tea, betraying an unease that Miss Marple's keen eyes did not miss. "Jane, so good of you to come," Amelia said, her voice bright but brittle, like porcelain on the verge of cracking. "Eleanor would have loved this, a gathering of friends." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle but her gaze sharp, taking in Amelia's fidgeting fingers and the way her eyes darted toward the vicarage door. She was a dear soul, always so generous with her time. The garden filled with familiar faces. Mrs. Price from the bakery, her apron dusted with flour. Mr. Jenkins, the postman, clutching a cup of tea as if it were an anchor. And Lily Parsons, the young maid from Ivy Cottage, her freckled face pale and her eyes red-rimmed from crying. Among the mourners were two figures of particular interest to Miss Marple. Dr. Elias Croft, the village physician, a stern man with wire-rimmed glasses and a habit of punctuating his sentences with Latin phrases, and Mr. Harold Green, the gardener at Ivy Cottage, whose burly frame and soil-stained hands suggested a life spent wrestling with the earth. Miss Marple settled on a wicker chair, her knitting bag at her feet, and accepted a cup of tea from Amelia. The brew was strong, with a hint of lemon, and she noted the teacup's delicate floral pattern, different from the one she'd seen at Ivy Cottage, with its telltale smudge. As the villagers chatted, their voices a soft hum against the buzz of bees, Miss Marple's mind turned to the mystery of Eleanor's death. Constable Slack's verdict of a heart attack seemed plausible, yet the smudge on the teacup, the unfinished letter, the tremor in his voice. She turned to Lily, who hovered nearby, twisting her apron into knots. "And you, Lily dear, you were close to Mrs. Hargrove. Did she ever mention such a pact?" Lily blushed, her auburn curls falling across her face. "She did, miss, once or twice," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something from her school days, with the vicar and Dr. Croft, I think. A promise to keep a secret buried. She said it weighed on her lately, but she wouldn't tell me what." Her eyes darted to Reginald, then away, as if fearful of his reaction. Before Miss Marple could press further, Amelia dropped a plate of scones, the china shattering on the stone path with a sound like a gunshot. "Oh, clumsy me," she exclaimed, kneeling to gather the fragments, her cheeks flushed. "I'm all thumbs today," but Miss Marple noted how Amelia's hands shook and how her eyes avoided meeting anyone's gaze, lingering instead on the roses as if they held answers. Reverend Hale hurried over, his face creased with concern. "No harm done, my dear," he said, his booming voice softening. "Let's not fuss." He patted Amelia's shoulder, but Miss Marple saw the tension in his grip, the way his fingers lingered a moment too long. The conversation shifted to Eleanor's contributions to the village, her donations to the church, her knack for organizing the annual fete. But Miss Marple's attention wandered to Dr. Croft, who stood by a trellis, his glasses glinting in the sunlight. She approached him, her steps slow and deliberate. "Dr. Croft, you attended Mrs. Hargrove often, I believe," she said, her tone conversational. "Her health was delicate, yet she seemed so vital." Croft adjusted his glasses, his expression guarded. "Cor fragilist. The heart is fragile, Miss Marple," he said. "I prescribed tonics, but she was stubborn, always refusing stronger measures. A heart attack was not unexpected." His voice was steady, but his fingers tightened around his teacup, and Miss Marple noted a faint tremor. "Indeed," she said, her eyes drifting to his black. "Argued with Reginald last week," he said gruffly. "About money, I reckon. He wanted her to sell the cottage. And Dr. Croft was there often with his tonics. Too often, if you ask me." He stabbed the spade into the earth, a gesture that spoke of frustration, or perhaps something deeper. Miss Marple nodded, her mind weaving connections. Harold's hands, capable of digging more than flower beds, could handle poisons. Rat bake, perhaps, with its faint almond scent. A red herring, or a clue. And Amelia's clumsiness, Reginald's nervousness, Croft's guardedness, each was a thread in the tapestry of Eleanor's death. As the gathering dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes on the roses. A single petal, caught in a spider's web, trembled in the breeze, as delicate and fleeting as truth in a village full of secrets. She thought of Eleanor's unfinished letter, its smudged ink, and the teacup's greasy mark. The pact, whatever it was, bound these people, Reginald, Amelia, Croft, perhaps even Hale. And Lily, sweet Lily, knew more than she let on. Miss Marple tucked her knitting into her bag and made her way home, the village settling into its evening hush. The clues were there, hidden in plain sight, like the roses that masked thorns beneath their beauty. She would unravel them, stitch by stitch, as she always did. Chapter 3. Threads of Suspicion. The afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains of St. Mary Mead, casting intricate patterns across the cobblestones as if the village itself were weaving secrets into its daily tapestry. Miss Jane Marple, her knitted shawl snug against the September chill, made her way to Ivy Cottage under the guise of retrieving a book she claimed Mrs. Eleanor Hargrove had lent her. The air carried the faint scent of wood smoke, mingling with the earthy dampness of autumn leaves, and the distant chime of the church clock marked the hour with a solemn note. Ivy Cottage loomed ahead, its overgrown vines curling like question marks around the windows, a silent testament to the mystery that had unsettled the village's quiet rhythm. Toward the drawing room as if expecting Eleanor's ghost to appear. She was restless, miss. Kept talking about a pact from her school days. Something with Mrs. Hale and Dr. Croft. She said it was time to set things right, but she wouldn't explain. Then she'd sit at that desk, writing letters she never finished. Lily's voice dropped to a whisper. I saw one, addressed to Mrs. Hale, but it was all smudged, like she'd changed her mind. Miss Marple nodded, her mind as sharp as the knitting needles in her bag. May I see the drawing room, dear? Just to collect that book. Lily led her inside, where the air was heavy with the memory of Eleanor's presence. The drawing room was unchanged since Miss Marple's last visit. Chintz curtains framed the windows. A mahogany sideboard held a vase of wilting roses, and the fireplace glowed faintly with dying embers. At the center stood the writing desk, its surface a tableau of halted intention. An inkwell, its contents spilled in a dark pool, a blotter, slightly askew, and a teacup, its lemon slice now shriveled. The unfinished letter, still open, caught Miss Marple's eye. She leaned closer, her glasses glinting, and read the faint, looping script. Dear Amelia, the pact must remain hidden, lest it destroy us all. The words trailed off, smudged as if Eleanor's hand had faltered under some unseen weight. Miss Marple's fingers brushed the teacup, noting again the greasy smudge on its rim. Not lipstick, she was certain, but something more curious. Perhaps oil from a glove or a cloth. She inhaled subtly, detecting a faint, acrid note beneath the lemon's tang, like almonds left too long in the sun. Curious, she murmured, her voice soft as the rustle of leaves outside. Eleanor always took her tea with lemon, yet this scent is unusual. Before Lily could respond, the door swung open, and Dr. Elias Croft entered, his black medical bag swinging. Perhaps make us imagine things. Tea is tea, Miss Marple. He turned to Lily, his tone brisk. "You must rest, girl. No more fussing over desks." He strode out, leaving a silence heavy with questions. Miss Marple lingered, her eyes scanning the room. A small photograph on the mantel caught her attention. A faded image of 3 young women and 2 men, laughing in a garden, their faces bright with youth. She recognized Eleanor's sharp features, Amelia Hale's auburn curls, and a younger Dr. Croft, his glasses absent, but his sternness already evident. The others, Reverend Hale and a stranger, hinted at the pact's origins. A clue, perhaps, tucked into the everyday. Later, at the village shop, Miss Marple paused to chat with Mrs. Price, whose tongue was as quick as her hands were deft with a rolling pin. The shop smelled of fresh bread and paraffin, and the counter was cluttered with jars of sweets and gossip. "It's a shame about Eleanor," Mrs. Price said, wrapping a loaf in brown paper. "But that Reginald, he's been poking around the cottage asking about its value, and Lily says he's contesting the will. Greedy, if you ask me." Miss Marple nodded, her mind weaving threads. "And Mrs. Hale, did she visit Eleanor often?" Mrs. Price leaned closer, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "Oh, aye. Amelia and Eleanor were thick as thieves in their youth. Amelia told me once, after a glass of sherry, about a silly pact they made. Something about a school prank, stealing exam papers. Harmless, she said, but it could ruin reputations now, what with the vicar involved and all." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her glasses. "How interesting. And Dr. Croft, did he mention anything?" Mrs. Price snorted. "That one? Always quoting Latin, acting superior. But he was at Ivy Cottage the day before she died, delivering another tonic. Said she was anxious, kept muttering about old promises." As Miss Marple left the shop, her basket heavier with bread and suspicion, she passed Harold Green, who was unloading sacks of potatoes from a cart. Her life. And the smudge. Oil, perhaps, from a gardener's glove or a doctor's bag. Or something more sinister, like poison disguised in a lemon slice. The village settled into its evening hush, the church spire a dark silhouette against the twilight. Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting needles clicking like a metronome, each stitch a step closer to unraveling the truth. The clues were there, hidden in the everyday, like threads waiting to be woven into a pattern only she could see. Chapter 4. The Gardener's Secret. The late September sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, painting the village in hues of amber and gold, as if reluctant to surrender the day to twilight. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the faint tang of chimney smoke from cottages nestled along the lane. Ivy Cottage stood at the heart of the village's quiet murmur, its overgrown vines whispering secrets to anyone who paused to listen. Miss Jane Marple, her knitted shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, made her way to the cottage's garden shed, her umbrella tapping a deliberate rhythm on the cobblestones. The inquest into Mrs. Eleanor Hargrove's death loomed, and the village buzzed with speculation. But Miss Marple sought answers not in gossip, but in the small, overlooked details of everyday life. The shed, tucked behind a row of rose bushes, was a weathered structure of peeling paint and rusted hinges, its interior a labyrinth of tools and earthy smells. Harold Green, the gardener at Ivy Cottage, was inside, his burly frame bent over a workbench cluttered with trowels, shears, and a small wooden bird he'd been carving, its wings half-formed. His hands, rough and stained with soil, moved with a precision that belied his gruff demeanor, and his eyes, shadowed beneath a worn cap, flicked up as Miss Marple knocked lightly on the doorframe. "Good afternoon, Harold," she said, her voice as warm as the fading sunlight. "I was passing by and thought to check on the roses. Mrs. Hargrove was so proud of them. You've kept them splendidly." Harold grunted, setting down his carving knife with that. "I know what she meant by that." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression as benign as a Sunday hymn. "A pact, you say? She mentioned it to me once. A youthful promise with old friends. Did she ever elaborate?" Harold shrugged, turning back to his carving. "Not to me. Just said it was old business, best left buried. But she was jumpy lately, always looking out the window, like she expected someone." He gestured toward a shelf where a small vial of rat poison sat among jars of fertilizer. Its label, faded but legible, warned of cyanide, a substance Miss Marple knew could carry an almond-like scent, like the one she'd detected in Eleanor's teacup. "Rat poison," she mused, her voice light. "You use it for the garden pests, I suppose." Harold's hand froze mid-carve, and he met her gaze, his eyes wary. "Aye, for the rats in the shed. But I keep it locked up. Nobody touches it but me." He pointed to a padlock on the shelf, though Miss Marple noted its clasp was loose, as if recently tampered with. "I ain't no killer, miss. Mrs. Hargrove owed me wages, true, but she was fair. I was at the Red Lion when she died. Ask anyone." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloging the loose padlock, the cyanide vial, and Harold's quick defense. A red herring, perhaps, or a thread in the tapestry of Eleanor's death. She thanked him and stepped outside, her eyes drifting to the ivy climbing the cottage walls. The vines, once meticulously trimmed, bore fresh cuts, as if someone had hacked at them hastily, perhaps to clear a path to a window. Harold's work, or another's? Her thoughts were interrupted by raised voices from the cottage gate. Reginald Hargrove, his city suit rumpled and his cufflinks glinting, was arguing with Lily Parsons, who clutched a broom as if it were a shield. "You know nothing of her will," Reginald snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut through the village's calm. "A maid getting an inheritance? Preposterous!" Lily's cheeks flushed, but her voice held steady. "She promised me, Mr. Hargrove." Was it fear, guilt, or something darker that had driven Eleanor to write those words? And the teacup's almond-like scent. Could it be cyanide slipped into her tea by a visitor? Harold had access to poison. Reginald had motive in the contested will. And Lily's inheritance raised questions of loyalty. Later at the village hall, Miss Marple attended a meeting of the Women's Institute, where gossip flowed as freely as the tea. Amelia Hale, her auburn hair pinned more neatly today, poured cups with a forced smile, her hands steadier but her eyes avoiding Miss Marple's. "Such a tragedy about Eleanor," Amelia said, passing a cup. "She was my oldest friend, you know. We shared so much in our youth." Miss Marple sipped her tea, noting its lemony tang, different from Eleanor's cup. "Indeed, Amelia. She mentioned a pact once from your school days. A silly thing, perhaps, but it seemed to weigh on her." Amelia's cup clinked against its saucer, a faint tremor betraying her calm. "Oh, that," she said, her laugh brittle. "Just a foolish vow we made. Stealing exam papers, nothing serious. But reputations matter, especially for Thomas." She glanced toward the vicar, who was speaking with Mrs. Price, his hands gesturing animatedly. Miss Marple's eyes followed, noting the vicar's flushed cheeks and the way his fingers clutched a hymn book, as if anchoring himself. The pact, she suspected, was more than a schoolgirl prank. Perhaps a wartime secret, tying Eleanor to Amelia, Croft, and Hale. But how did it lead to murder? And the cyanide? Could it have been stolen from Harold's shed, or was it a misdirection? As the meeting ended, Miss Marple lingered, her knitting needles clicking softly in her bag. She overheard Mrs. Price whisper to a neighbor, "Reginald's been asking about selling the cottage. Says it's his by right. But Eleanor changed her will, I heard, to favor Lily. And Dr. Croft was there the day before, fussing with his tonics." The words hung in the air, like threads waiting to be woven. Miss Marple walked home under a sky streaked with twilight, the village settling in. Chapter 5. The Doctor's Dilemma. The autumn dusk draped St. Mary Mead in a soft violet haze, the village's thatched roofs and winding lanes softened by the glow of lamplight spilling from cottage windows. The air carried the crisp bite of falling leaves, mingled with the faint sweetness of apples from the vicarage orchard, where the trees stood like silent sentinels over the village's secrets. Miss Jane Marple, her knitted shawl tucked snugly against the evening chill, made her way to Dr. Elias Croft's surgery, her umbrella tapping a thoughtful rhythm on the cobblestone path. The inquest into Mrs. Eleanor Hargrove's death was drawing closer, and while Constable Slack clung to his verdict of a heart attack, Miss Marple's mind was a whirl of threads, smudged letters, cut ivy, and a teacup with an almond-like scent that refused to align with so simple a conclusion. The surgery, a modest brick building beside the village green, was as orderly as its owner, its windows glowing with the warm light of a single lamp. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and polished wood, a stark contrast to the earthy chaos of Harold Green's shed. Dr. Croft sat at his desk, his wire-rimmed glasses perched low on his nose as he scribbled notes in a ledger. His black medical bag rested on a side table, its leather worn but meticulously clean, and a row of glass vials, tonics and remedies, lined a shelf behind him. He looked up as Miss Marple entered, his stern face softening into a practiced smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Miss Marple," he said, rising slightly, "what brings you here? A touch of rheumatism, perhaps?" His tone was polite, but his fingers tightened on his pen, a gesture Miss Marple noted with quiet interest. "Oh, nothing so serious, Doctor," she replied, settling into a chair with a smile as benign as a church bazaar. "A slight headache, perhaps from all this sad business with Eleanor Hargrove. You attended her often, I believe. Her tonics, were they strong?" Croft adjusted his glasses, his expression guarded. Mild sedatives, most faint tremor as he set down his pen. "Tea leaves vary, you know. Nothing unusual." He rose, gesturing to a shelf. "Would you like a tonic for that headache?" Miss Marple declined with a gentle wave, her eyes lingering on the vials. One, labeled sedative, was half empty, its stoppers slightly askew. A clue, perhaps, or another thread in the tapestry. She thanked him and left, her mind turning to Croft's unease. His frequent visits to Ivy Cottage, his tonics, his quick dismissal of the teacup scent, each suggested more than professional concern. As she stepped into the evening air, the village was settling into its quiet rhythm, the church spire a dark silhouette against the twilight sky. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the photograph she'd seen in Eleanor's drawing room. A faded image of Eleanor, Amelia Hale, Croft, and Reverend Hale, with a fifth figure, a stranger, partially obscured. The pact, Eleanor had hinted, was a youthful vow, but its weight seemed to linger, binding these old friends in a web of secrets. Could Croft's tonics have been more than sedatives? And the almond-like scent, cyanide perhaps from Harold's shed, or another source? Her musings were interrupted by a visit from Amelia Hale, who appeared at Mead Cottage just as Miss Marple was setting out her tea tray. Amelia's auburn hair was neatly pinned, but her hands fidgeted with a lace handkerchief, and her eyes darted nervously to the windows. "Jane, I hope I'm not intruding," she said, her voice breathless. "I've been so upset about Eleanor. We were school friends, you know, closer than sisters once." Miss Marple poured tea, noting the floral pattern on her own cups, different from Eleanor's. "Of course, Amelia. It's a terrible loss. Eleanor mentioned a pact from those days, I recall. Something about a shared secret?" Amelia's handkerchief twisted tighter and her smile faltered. "Oh, that old thing," she said, her laugh brittle as dry leaves. "A silly prank, stealing exam papers to help a friend pass. Harmless, really, but it could look bad now, especially fingers, her nervous haste and her mention of confession. The pact, it seemed, was more than a prank. Perhaps a wartime indiscretion, a secret worth killing to protect. And the teacup smudge. Could it be ink, like Amelia's, or oil from a glove, or something more sinister? The next morning, Miss Marple visited the village post office, where gossip flowed as freely as the stamps. Mrs. Jenkins, the postmistress, was sorting letters, her nimble fingers pausing as Miss Marple approached. "Morning, Miss Marple," she said, her eyes bright with curiosity. "All this talk about Eleanor, it's dreadful. I heard Reginald's been asking about her will, says it's not fair. And Lily told me Dr. Croft was at the cottage the day before, delivering a new tonic." Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles clicking softly in her bag. "Indeed. And Mrs. Hale, did she send any letters to Eleanor recently?" Mrs. Jenkins leaned closer, her voice a whisper. "Not letters, but she dropped off a basket of lemons last week. For Eleanor's tea. Said it was a neighborly gift. Funny, though. Eleanor usually bought her own from the grocer." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her glasses. Lemons. A gift? Or a vehicle for something darker? She thanked Mrs. Jenkins and stepped outside, where the village green was alive with children playing, their laughter a stark contrast to the shadows in her mind. The smudged letter, the almond-like scent, the ink on Amelia's fingers, the half-empty vial in Croft's surgery. These were no mere coincidences. Harold's cyanide, Reginald's greed, Lily's inheritance, Amelia's nerves, and now Croft's tonics. Each was a thread in the pattern of Eleanor's death. As she walked home, the village settled into its morning hum, the scent of baking bread drifting from the bakery. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the pact, its roots deep in the past, perhaps tied to a wartime secret, a hidden deserter, a stolen artifact, or something more personal. Jane Marple, her knitted shawl pinned neatly, walked the familiar path to the cottage, her umbrella tapping a steady rhythm against the dew-kissed cobblestones. The inquest loomed, and while Constable Slack remained steadfast in his verdict of a heart attack, Miss Marple's mind wove together threads. The smudged letter, the almond-like scent in the teacup, the loose padlock on Harold's poison vial that suggested a darker pattern. Her destination was the cottage's garden, where the ivy's tangled embrace had caught her attention. The vines, once Eleanor's pride, bore fresh cuts, as if someone had slashed them to clear a path, perhaps to a window. Miss Marple paused by the rose bushes, their thorns glinting in the morning light, and examined the ivy more closely. The cuts were uneven, hasty, and a single leaf caught in a spider's web bore a faint smear of oil. Similar, she noted, to the greasy smudge on Eleanor's teacup. "Curious," she murmured, her voice soft as the mist. Had someone climbed through a window? Or was this a gardener's carelessness? A clue or another false lead? Her thoughts were interrupted by the crunch of gravel, and she turned to see Lily Parsons, the young maid, hurrying toward the cottage with a basket of laundry. Lily's freckled face was flushed, her auburn curls escaping her cap, and her eyes widened at the sight of Miss Marple. "Oh, miss, you startled me," she said, clutching the basket. "I was just bringing Mrs. Hargrove's linens. Thought I'd tidy up before the inquest." Miss Marple smiled, her gaze gentle but piercing. "You're a devoted girl, Lily. Tell me, did you ever see anyone tampering with the ivy? It seems disturbed." Lily's fingers tightened on the basket, and she glanced at the vines. I don't know, miss. Mr. Green's been pruning, but not like he used to. And Mr. Hargrove, Reginald, was here last week poking about the garden. Said he was checking the property's value." Her voice wavered, and she added, Were interrupted by the sight of Reginald Hargrove, his city suit out of place among the roses, striding toward the village square. His cufflinks gleamed, and his face was set in a scowl, as if the cottage itself offended him. Miss Marple followed at a discreet distance, her umbrella a silent companion. At the village square, a fête was in full swing, with stalls of homemade jams and children chasing hoops. Reverend Thomas Hale stood on a makeshift platform, his white hair gleaming as he preached on forgiveness, his voice booming over the crowd. Yet Miss Marple noted his hands trembling, clutching the edges of his hymn book, and his eyes scanning the faces as if seeking someone, or something. The pact, she thought, weighed heavily on him too. She approached Amelia Hale, who was arranging a stall of knitted scarves, her auburn hair neatly pinned but her fingers fidgeting with a skein of wool. "Amelia, dear," Miss Marple said, her voice warm. "Such a lovely fête. Eleanor would have been proud. Did she ever join you in planning these events?" Amelia's smile was strained, her eyes avoiding Miss Marple's. "Oh, yes. She loved the fête," she said, her voice too bright. "We planned it together, years ago, when we were young and foolish, made all sorts of promises then." She laughed, a brittle sound, and dropped a scarf, stooping quickly to retrieve it. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her glasses. "Promises, yes. Eleanor mentioned a pact once, a youthful vow, perhaps more serious than it seemed." Amelia's hand stilled, and a flush crept up her neck. "Just silly things, Jane. Schoolgirl oaths, you know. Nothing to trouble anyone now." She turned to a customer, her movements jerky, and Miss Marple noted a faint ink stain on her sleeve, reminiscent of the smudge on Eleanor's letter. The fête buzzed with activity, but Miss Marple's attention shifted to Dr. Elias Croft, who stood by a tea stall, his wire-rimmed glasses glinting as he sipped a cup. She approached, her manner as unassuming as a sparrow. Slipped into the cottage, perhaps to tamper with Eleanor's tea. Or was it Croft, with his vials and tonics, hiding a darker purpose? And Amelia's ink-stained sleeve, did it link to the smudged letter, or was it a coincidence? The almond-like scent in the teacup she suspected was no accident, cyanide perhaps from Harold's shed, or a subtler poison from Croft's surgery. She lingered by the square, watching the villagers disperse. Harold Green passed by, his spade over his shoulder, his eyes avoiding hers. She recalled his loose padlock and the cyanide vial. Too obvious, perhaps. A misdirection to point suspicion his way. The pact, she thought, was the key. A wartime secret, binding Eleanor to Amelia, Croft, and Hale. But how had it led to murder? And the teacup's scent? Could it be poison, delivered in a lemon slice, by someone Eleanor trusted? Miss Marple walked home as the village settled into its evening hush, the stars emerging like tiny clues in the sky. She sat by her fire, her knitting needles clicking softly, each stitch a step closer to the truth. The cut ivy, the bent latch, the ink stain, the vial in Croft's pocket. These were threads in a tangled web, and she would unravel them, as she always did. Chapter 7. Unraveling Knots. The morning sun rose over St. Mary Mead, casting a gentle glow across the village's thatched roofs and dew-kissed meadows, as if polishing the world for a fresh start. The air was crisp, scented with the faint musk of damp leaves and the warm aroma of baking bread drifting from Mrs. Price's bakery. Ivy Cottage stood quietly at the village's heart, its tangled vines catching the light like a net of secrets, each leaf a silent witness to Mrs. Eleanor Hargrove's untimely death. Miss Jane Marple, her knitted shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, sat in her parlor at Mead Cottage, her fingers working a skein of pale blue wool as she arrived. Their faces betrayed varying shades of unease. Reginald, his city suit immaculate but his cufflinks polished to an obsessive sheen, sat stiffly, his eyes darting to the door. Amelia, her auburn hair pinned tightly, clutched a lace handkerchief, her smile brittle as she complimented the tea. Dr. Croft, his wire-rimmed glasses glinting, adjusted his tie repeatedly, his stern demeanor softened by a nervous edge. Lily, her freckled face pale, hovered near the sideboard, her hands twisting her apron. Reverend Hale, his white hair slightly disheveled, spoke of Eleanor's kindness, but his hands trembled as he held his teacup, the floral pattern distinct from the one in Eleanor's drawing room. Miss Marple poured tea, her movements deliberate, her voice as warm as the firelight. "Such a sad time for St. Mary Mead," she said, passing a cup to Reginald. "Eleanor's death has left us all shaken." "I was just thinking of her tea. She was so particular. Always with a lemon slice, never sugar. Yet that cup in her drawing room had an unusual scent, almost like almonds." Croft's cup clinked sharply against its saucer, and he coughed, masking the sound. "Tea varies, Miss Marple," he said, his voice tight. "Perhaps a new blend." His fingers tightened on his glasses, a gesture Miss Marple noted with interest. Amelia's handkerchief twisted into a knot, and she laughed, a brittle sound. "Oh, Jane, you do notice everything. Eleanor loved her routines, didn't she?" Her eyes flicked to her husband, who stared into his tea, his face flushed. Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her mind was sharp. "Indeed." And she mentioned a pact once, from her youth, a promise with old friends. It seemed to trouble her lately, as if she wished to confess something. Lily gasped softly, her hand brushing a locket at her throat, engraved with Eleanor's initials. "She did, miss," she said, her voice trembling. "She told me she was the key, and she needed to unravel its true nature." "Speaking of old promises," she said, her voice gentle, "I found a curious photograph in Eleanor's drawing room. 5 young people, including you, Amelia, and Dr. Croft, and you, Reverend. A wartime memory, perhaps?" Amelia's handkerchief slipped to the floor and she stooped to retrieve it, her face pale. "Just a school photo," she said quickly. "We were all so young then, full of silly ideas." But her voice wavered, and Miss Marple noted an ink stain on her sleeve, faint but unmistakable. Croft adjusted his glasses, his smile strained. "Juventus audax, youth is bold, Miss Marple. We made foolish vows, but they're long forgotten." His hand brushed his pocket where Miss Marple had seen a vial at the fete, and she wondered if his tonics held more than sedatives. Lily, emboldened, spoke up. "Mrs. Hargrove said it was about the war, a promise to protect someone. She mentioned the vicar's brother, said he was in trouble once and they all swore to keep it secret." Her words hung in the air and Reverend Hale's teacup rattled, his face ashen. "Enough," Hale said, his voice low but firm. "Eleanor's gone. Let her rest." He stood, guiding Amelia to the door, and the others followed, their footsteps heavy with unspoken truths. Alone, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting resumed, each stitch a step closer to clarity. Lily's revelation was crucial. The pact involved protecting the vicar's brother, perhaps a deserter from the war, a secret that could ruin reputations. But why kill Eleanor now? Had she threatened to confess, as Lily suggested? And the method, poison, likely cyanide, in a lemon slice, delivered by someone close. Harold's vial was too obvious, a red herring, but Croft's tonics and Amelia's lemons were subtler threads. The ink stain on Amelia's sleeve, the smudged letter, the photograph, these pointed to a truth hidden in plain sight. The next day Miss Marple visited the church where Reverend Hale was polishing the brass lectern, a knot, and Miss Marple was close to unraveling them. She walked home, the village bathed in midday light, its quiet hum a contrast to the storm in her mind. The truth was near, hidden in the everyday, waiting for her keen eyes to pluck it free. Chapter 8. The Narrowing Path. The late September light bathed St. Mary Mead in a soft golden sheen, the village's thatched cottages and winding lanes glowing as if dusted with autumn's gentle touch. The air carried the crisp scent of fallen apples, mingling with the faint smoke of wood fires, as the village stirred with its usual hum of daily life. Yet beneath this tranquil surface, a current of unease rippled, centered on Ivy Cottage, where the tangled vines seemed to tighten their grip, guarding the secrets of Mrs. Eleanor Hargrove's death. Miss Jane Marple, her knitted shawl snug against the morning chill, sat by her parlor window at Mead Cottage, her fingers pausing over a half-finished scarf as her mind wove together the clues that refused to align with Constable Slack's verdict of a heart attack. The smudged letter, the almond-like scent in the teacup, the cut ivy, the loose padlock on Harold's poison vial. These were threads in a tapestry pointing to murder, and Miss Marple was determined to unravel the truth. The tea party had tightened the web of suspicion, with Reginald's greed, Amelia's nerves, Croft's unease, and Hale's guilt all pointing to a wartime pact, a vow to protect the vicar's deserter brother. But the method, poison, likely cyanide in a lemon slice, suggested a calculated act by someone close. Harold's alibi held, and his vial seemed too obvious a red herring. Miss Marple decided to revisit Ivy Cottage, seeking the one clue that would narrow the path to the killer. She arrived at the cottage under the pretense of offering Lily Parsons a skein of wool for her sewing circle. The garden was quiet, the roses drooping under their own weight, and the ivy's fresh cuts glinted in the sunlight, their edges curling like unanswered questions. Lily met her at the door, and mahogany sideboard a silent elegy to Eleanor's life. The desk, still cluttered with the inkwell and teacup, held Miss Marple's attention. She opened the drawer Lily indicated, revealing a small locked-in box, its surface etched with a faded rose. The lock was simple, and with Lily's permission, Miss Marple used a hairpin, her fingers as deft as her mind, to open it. Inside lay a bundle of letters, yellowed with age, and a single photograph, identical to the one on the mantel but clearer. Eleanor, Amelia, Croft, Hale, and a young man, his face strikingly similar to Hale's. "Her brother," Lily whispered, peering over Miss Marple's shoulder. "She said he was the reason for the pact, to keep him safe. But she wanted to tell the truth, to clear her conscience." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes scanning the letters. One, dated 1942, was from Amelia to Eleanor, its tone urgent. "We must never speak of it for Thomas's sake. The pact holds us all." Another from Croft was curt. "Keep silent, Eleanor, or we all suffer." The words confirmed the wartime secret, a vow to hide Hale's deserter brother. But why kill now? Miss Marple's fingers brushed the photograph, noting a faint ink smudge on its edge, like the one on Eleanor's letter, a clue tying the pact to the crime. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock, and Amelia Hale entered, her auburn hair neatly pinned, but her hands fidgeting with a lace handkerchief. "Jane, I heard you were here," she said, her voice breathless. "I wanted to help Lily tidy up. Eleanor would have wanted it." Her eyes flicked to the open box, and her face paled. Miss Marple closed the box gently, her smile disarming. "How kind, Amelia. I was just admiring Eleanor's keepsakes. She mentioned a pact, you know, from the war. Something about protecting someone." Amelia's handkerchief pointed to motive, but he lacked access to the cottage that night. Croft's tonics were suspicious, but his patience confirmed his presence elsewhere. Determined to test her theory, Miss Marple visited the village greengrocer, Mr. Baxter, whose shop smelled of apples and earth. "Mornin', Miss Marple," he said, polishing an apple. "Terrible business about Mrs. Hargrove. I heard the inquest tomorrow." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. "I was wondering about lemons. Mrs. Hargrove loved them for her tea. Did she buy them here, or did someone else supply them?" Mr. Baxter scratched his head. "Funny you ask. She always bought from me, but Mrs. Hale brought her a basket of lemons last week, from the vicarage orchard. Said they were a gift. Odd, though. They weren't the usual kind. A bit bitter-looking." Miss Marple's heart quickened. Bitter lemons, an almond-like scent, Amelia's ink-stained cuff, the threads were aligning. She thanked Mr. Baxter and walked to the church where Reverend Hale was tending the roses, his white hair gleaming in the sunlight. "Reverend," she said gently, "Eleanor's confession. Did it trouble you?" Hale's hands stilled, his eyes distant. "She wanted to tell the truth about my brother," he said quietly. "I begged her not to. It would ruin my position, the church. Amelia was frantic, said it would destroy us." His voice broke and he turned away, his shoulders slumped. Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. Amelia's lemons, the ink stains, the pact's weight. These pointed to her, not Croft or Reginald. The cyanide, likely stolen from Harold's shed, could have been slipped into a lemon slice, a subtle delivery for a deadly dose. The smudged letter, the photograph, the cut ivy. These were distractions, but the lemons were the key. She returned home, the village settling into its midday calm, the scent of baking bread a comforting note. Sitting by her fire, her knitting needles clicking softly, Miss Marple saw the pattern clearly. Threads of the mystery. The smudged letter. The almond-like scent in the teacup. The cut ivy. The wartime pact that pointed to a calculated murder. Not a heart attack, as Constable Slack insisted. The inquest was hours away, and Miss Marple's tea party had narrowed the suspects. Reginald Hargrove's greed, Amelia Hale's nerves, Dr. Elias Croft's unease, and Reverend Thomas Hale's guilt, all tied to a wartime vow to protect Hale's deserter brother. The tin box's letters and photograph had confirmed the pact's weight, but the method, poison, likely cyanide in a lemon slice, suggested a killer among Eleanor's closest circle. Amelia's ink-stained cuff and her gift of bitter lemons were the strongest threads, yet doubts lingered about Croft's tonics and Reginald's motives. Miss Marple resolved to visit the vicarage, hoping to uncover the final clue to lift the veil on the truth. The vicarage was a picture of quiet elegance, its rose bushes trimmed and its windows glowing with morning light. Amelia Hale met Miss Marple at the door, her auburn hair neatly pinned, but her hands fidgeting with a lace handkerchief, her eyes shadowed with worry. "Jane, how kind of you to call," she said, her voice brittle as dry leaves. "Thomas is in the study, preparing for the inquest. It's all so dreadful." Miss Marple smiled, her gaze gentle but piercing. "Indeed, Amelia. I was thinking of Eleanor, her love for this village, her tea with lemon. Those lemons you gave her, from the vicarage orchard, were they a special variety?" Amelia's handkerchief twisted into a knot, and her cheeks flushed. "Oh, just ordinary lemons," she said quickly. "A neighborly gift, you know. Eleanor loved them." Her eyes darted to the study door, where Reverend Hale's silhouette was visible, hunched over his desk. Miss Marple nodded, her mind noting Amelia's unease and the ink stain on her sleeve, faint but persistent. "She mentioned a pact once, from your youth," she said softly. "A promise to protect, to keep it secret, for his sake and ours. Eleanor thought confession would free us, but I begged her to stay silent. The scandal." He trailed off, his fingers trembling on the hymn book. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was sharp. The pact was clear, a wartime vow to protect Robert Hale, not a deserter, but a broken man, hidden to preserve reputations. Yet Eleanor's insistence on confession had threatened them all. The lemons, the ink stains, the almond-like scent, these pointed to Amelia, desperate to protect her husband. But was there more? She returned to Ivy Cottage, where Lily Parsons was sweeping the porch, her freckled face pale, her locket gleaming at her throat. "Lily, dear," Miss Marple said, "that locket. It's Eleanor's, isn't it? Did she give it to you?" Lily's hand flew to the locket, her eyes wide. "She did, miss, as a keepsake. Said it was from her school days, a reminder of her friends. She was so kind, but so troubled lately. Kept saying she had to make things right." Her voice wavered, and she resumed sweeping, her movements jerky. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the drawing-room window, where the cut ivy hung in ragged strands. Inside, she re-examined the desk, noting the teacup's faint almond scent. Cyanide, she was certain, likely from Harold's shed, though his alibi held. The smudged letter to Amelia lay open, its words haunting. "The pact must remain hidden, lest it destroy us all." But a new detail caught her eye. A tiny scrap of paper beneath the blotter, bearing a single word in Eleanor's hand. "Lemons." Her heart quickened. Amelia's lemons, the ink stains, the pact's threat. The pieces were aligning. She visited the greengrocer, Mr. Baxter, whose shop was a haven of earthy scents. "Those lemons Mrs. Hale gave Eleanor," she said, her voice casual. "You mentioned they were bitter. Did you see them yourself?" Mr. Baxter nodded, polishing an apple. "Aye, miss. Odd-looking things." His voice held a faint tremor. And Miss Marple noted a bottle of sedative on his desk, its label smudged with ink. As she left, the village was settling into its midday calm, children's laughter echoing from the green. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Reginald Hargrove, whose greed had been a distraction. His absence at the cottage that night, confirmed by the Red Lion's patrons, cleared him of direct involvement. But his pressure on Eleanor's will suggested a motive to silence her. Yet Amelia's lemons, her ink-stained cuff, her frantic defense of the pact, these were the strongest threads. Sitting by her fire, her knitting needles clicking softly, Miss Marple saw the pattern clearly. Amelia, desperate to protect her husband's reputation, had poisoned Eleanor's tea with cyanide, likely stolen from Harold's shed and laced into a lemon slice. The ink stains linked her to the smudged letter, written as Eleanor planned her confession. Croft's unease suggested he suspected the truth, perhaps recognizing the poison he'd handled in his surgery. The cut ivy and bent latch were distractions, red herrings to suggest an intruder. The veil was lifting, the truth emerging like stars in a clearing sky. One final step remained, to confront the killer and unravel the pact's last knot. Chapter 10. The Final Stitch. The October sky over St. Mary Mead was a tapestry of soft blues and golds, the autumn sun casting a gentle warmth across the village's thatched cottages and winding lanes. The air was alive with the crisp scent of fallen leaves and the faint sweetness of apples from the vicarage orchard, a reminder of the village's enduring charm. Ivy Cottage stood at the heart of St. Mary Mead, its tangled vines softened by the morning light, no longer menacing but serene, as if the truth about Mrs. Eleanor Hargrove's death had finally loosened their grip. Miss Jane Marple, her knitted shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, sat in her parlor at Mead Cottage, her fingers working the final stitches of a pale blue scarf, her mind as sharp as the needles in her hands. Vicarage Parlor was a haven of quiet elegance, its rose-patterned wallpaper glowing in the firelight, the scent of lavender and freshly brewed tea filling the air. Amelia, her auburn hair tightly pinned, arranged teacups with trembling hands, her smile brittle as she greeted the guests. Reverend Hale stood by the hearth, his white hair disheveled, his eyes heavy with unspoken guilt. Dr. Croft, his wire-rimmed glasses glinting, sipped tea with a forced calm, his fingers brushing a vial in his pocket. Reginald, his city suit immaculate, toyed with his cufflinks, his scowl deepening as he glanced at Lily, who hovered near the door, her freckled face pale, her locket gleaming at her throat. Miss Marple took her place by the window, her knitting bag at her feet, her voice as gentle as the morning breeze. "Such a fitting tribute to Eleanor," she said, passing a plate of scones. She loved her tea, always with a lemon slice, never sugar. Yet that teacup in her drawing room had a curious scent, like almonds. Not her usual blend, I thought. Amelia's teacup rattled, and she set it down, her handkerchief twisting into a knot. "Tea varies, Jane," she said, her voice high. "Perhaps a mistake in the kitchen." Her eyes darted to her husband, who stared into the fire, his hands clutching a hymn book. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her glasses. "Perhaps. But Eleanor was troubled, wasn't she? By a pact from your youth, a promise to protect someone during the war. Reverend Hale's brother, Robert, I believe." Hale's hymn book slipped, clattering to the floor, and his face paled. "It was for his safety," he said, his voice low. "He was ill, not a deserter. We hid him, Eleanor, Amelia, Elias and I. She wanted to confess, but it would have ruined us." His eyes met Amelia's, a silent plea. Croft cleared his throat, his fingers tightening on his cup. "Semper idem, Miss Marple. Old promises fade." Eleanor's heart was weak. No need to stir up trouble. But his voice held a tremor, fell to the floor. "They were a gift," she stammered. "Just lemons, nothing more." But her voice broke, and her eyes flicked to the teacup on the tray, its floral pattern matching Eleanor's. Miss Marple set down her cup, her voice steady but firm. "I found a scrap of paper in Eleanor's desk, with one word, lemons. And the teacup scent, cyanide, I believe, stolen from Harold Green's shed where the padlock was loose. Someone close to Eleanor laced a lemon slice with poison, knowing her habits. The ink on your cuff, Amelia, matches the smudged letter. You were desperate to protect the pact, to save Thomas's reputation." Amelia gasped, her hands flying to her face. "No, Jane, you're wrong," she cried. "I loved Eleanor. She was my friend." But her voice cracked, and she sank into a chair, sobbing. Reverend Hale stepped forward, his face ashen. "Amelia," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Did you? For me?" He turned to Miss Marple, his eyes pleading. "She didn't mean harm. Eleanor's confession would have ruined us, the church, my brother's memory. Amelia was protecting us." Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her resolve was firm. "A pact can bind too tightly," she said. "Eleanor wanted to free you all, but fear drove you to silence her, Amelia. The lemons, laced with cyanide, were your method, a neighborly gift, turned deadly." Caraft's face hardened, and he rose, his vial clinking in his pocket. "This is speculation, Miss Marple, no proof." But his voice wavered, and Miss Marple noted his unease. He had suspected the poison, perhaps recognizing the cyanide he used in his surgery. Lily sobbed, clutching her locket. "Mrs. Hargrove was kind. She didn't deserve this." Reginald stood, his scowl fading into shock, his greed irrelevant in the face of truth. Miss Marple turned to Constable Slack, who had arrived quietly, summoned by a note she'd sent earlier. "Constable, the evidence is clear. The teacup, the lemons,